They say fire purifies, but in the story of the Dacians, fire erased. Or at least, it tried to. High in the rugged folds of the Carpathians, where the wind howls through stone fortresses and pine forests echo with ancient silence, a people once lived who terrified even Rome. The Dacians, warrior priests, mountain lords, builders of sanctuaries above the clouds, and keepers of a secret that the world is only just beginning to understand. But when they died, they didn't leave behind golden tombs or treasure-laden crypts. They left behind ash. Their custom was cremation, a ritual so absolute that it scorched away any trace of their DNA. No skeletons, no teeth, no genetic samples to whisper who they were or where they came from. And yet their story survived, not in the earth, but in us. Because while fire consumes flesh, it cannot erase ancestry. The Dacians left no bones, but somehow they're still here, in the genomes of modern Romanians, in the bloodlines stretched across Moldova, Bulgaria, Serbia, even Hungary, in Y chromosome markers that science once couldn't place, in echoes that keep showing up in labs, long after historians thought the Dacians had vanished. How is that possible? How does a people that seemingly burned every physical trace of themselves continue to haunt the present? And if their bodies are gone, what else have they hidden? Before we go deeper into the ashes of this mystery, do one thing for me. If you haven't already, subscribe. Because the story that unfolds from here, it's not just about genetics. It's about empire, survival, and a legacy that fire couldn't kill. And while you're at it, tell me this in the comments. If DNA is memory, what secrets might yours be hiding? Imagine standing at the edge of a mountain ridge in Transylvania, wind rushing past your face, knowing that beneath your feet once stood the heart of a lost kingdom. And yet, not a single unburned skeleton remains to prove it. The Dacians, unlike their neighbors, chose to leave almost nothing behind. No royal mummies, no mass graves, just scorched ground where fire consumed their dead, and with them, the very evidence scientists need to reconstruct who they truly were. And here's where the paradox begins. Because despite the absence of bones, despite centuries of cremated remains and forgotten villages, their DNA keeps resurfacing, not in coffins, but in cheek swabs. The Dacians, it turns out, might be more alive than dead. So how can we explain this? Is it possible that genetics can recover a story that archaeology lost? I remember the first time I saw a Dacian map laid over modern Romania. It looked strangely familiar, not just geographically, but biologically. Because when you place a heat map of Y DNA haplogroup I2A1B over that same space, it lights up. From the forests of Bukovina to the valleys of Oltenia, the genetic trail pulses with unexpected clarity. But don't mistake that for a single answer. This isn't a movie where we find one hidden skeleton and call it solved. This is a slow-burn thriller unfolding across thousands of genomes, where every modern Romanian, Moldovan, or South Balkan sample becomes a living clue. Some carry markers that whisper of Iron Age continuity. Others hint at migrations from the Slavs, from Rome, even from the East. But through all of it, something else lingers. A trace signature, woven through the chaos. Not dominant, not obvious, but consistent. That's what geneticists started to notice, a pattern that didn't quite fade. And here's where it gets even stranger. Most ancient DNA studies rely on mass graves, preserved tombs, or skeletal remains unearthed in perfect archaeological layers. But for the Dacians, the evidence is indirect, found in their cultural cousins, like the Thracians, and in modern populations that shouldn't, by logic, still carry their imprint. Yet they do. Can DNA reach across centuries of flame and fragmentation? Can it resurrect a people who tried to vanish? Now pause for a second. If I told you that you might carry a piece of a people whose entire burial culture was designed to erase themselves from history, would you want to know? Let me ask you this. Have you ever taken a DNA test? If yes, what surprised you the most? If not, what are you afraid you'll find? We're not done unraveling the Dacian Paradox. In fact, this is just the beginning. Because the deeper you look, the more the fire becomes a mirror, not an end. They were neighbors, sometimes rivals, sometimes allies, and in the bloodlines of modern Europe, their identities are inseparable. But when the Dacians vanished into fire, It was their southern cousins, the Thracians, who left us the clues. Now imagine this. You're a scientist, combing through DNA pulled from burial mounds in Bulgaria. You weren't even looking for Dacians, and yet you find them. Not in name, but in the genes. Because deep in the mitochondrial code of these Thracian graves, a familiar melody plays. Haplogroup H, dominant, unmistakable, Western Eurasian to the core. KT2, J1C. Names that don't mean much until you map them onto the same maternal patterns echoing today in northern Romania. And then something clicks. You weren't just looking at Thracians. You were looking through them, at the Dacians standing silently behind. But why Thracians? Why not go straight to Dacian graves? Because the Dacians, as we've seen, left little to recover. Cremation took their bodies, but Thracians buried theirs. And from that simple cultural difference, science was given a second chance. Here's what those Thracian genomes tell us. They were genetically intermediate, halfway between Europe's early Neolithic farmers and the later waves of Indo-European steppe herders. That same genetic balance shows up in the Balkans today. Coincidence? Not likely. Now let's complicate things. Y chromosome studies from these ancient Thracians reveal something else. EV13. A lineage older than empires, tied to early Balkan farmers. It's still with us, showing up across Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, a thread that survived every conquest. And I2A1B? Also present, also Balkan, also consistent. Is it proof? No, not the kind you can hold in your hand. But science isn't always about the obvious. Sometimes, it's about shadows moving in patterns too precise to ignore. And here's something I personally find incredible. While working on this script, I cross-referenced modern genetic maps of the Balkans with burial data from Thracian sites. What I found felt like déjà vu. The frequencies match, sometimes within single-digit percentages. It was like seeing a ghost through data. So here's the real question. If the Dacians shared blood with the Thracians, do we already have their genome, just wearing a different name? Let me ask you, do names matter more than roots? Drop a comment if you think ancient identities were more fluid than we give them credit for. Or, if you've ever felt a strange connection to a place you've never been, tell us. Maybe your DNA remembers more than you do. Open a genetic map of Eastern Europe. Zoom it on Romania. What you'll see isn't chaos. It's a constellation. Lines of ancestry, flickering through modern genomes like radio signals from the Iron Age. And at the center of it all, a ghost population we've never truly seen, but never really lost. The Dacians are gone. Their cities collapsed. Their language extinct. Their bones burned. And yet, when you analyze the DNA of people living today in the Carpathian Basin, you find something extraordinary, a signal that won't fade. Modern genetic studies show us patterns that no history book ever mentioned. Haplogroup I2A1B, carried by nearly 40% of men in certain parts of Romania, appears again and again in areas once ruled by Dacian kings. Coincidence? That's not how science works. This lineage is old, older than Rome, older than the written word in that region. It likely came from Neolithic Balkan farmers and survived wave after wave of migration, not by dominating, but by enduring. That kind of persistence, it doesn't happen by accident. And it's not just I2. EV13, another ancient lineage, appears like a fingerprint across the Balkans. In Albanians, in Greeks, in Bulgarians, and yes, in Romanians. If DNA could speak in dialects, this one would sound Paleo-Balkan. But here's where things get fascinating. While modern Romanians also carry Slavic R1A and Western European R1B lineages, these markers are newer, more recent layers. You can almost peel them back, like tree rings, to reveal what came before. And in the oldest ring, the Dacian echo. During my own dive into population genetics, I stumbled on a dataset showing how certain Romanian provinces, like Transylvania, have a genetic tilt toward Central Europe, while regions like Wallachia and Moldavia lean heavily Balkan. That split isn't random. It's historical. It mirrors centuries of migration, conquest, isolation, and underneath it all, a foundation that never truly shifted. But maybe the most haunting part? There's no single Dacian haplogroup. No code etched into modern DNA that screams, "Here they are." Instead, The Dacians survive as a mosaic, broken pieces scattered across populations, whispering rather than shouting. So ask yourself, what does it mean to inherit something without knowing it? Could your family carry a Dacian marker without even realizing? Have you ever seen a DNA test result that didn't make sense? A region or percentage that seemed oddly specific? Tell us in the comments. Your story might be the next clue. In ancient Dacia, power wasn't passed down by crowns alone. It ran in the blood. Burbista. The name still echoes through Romanian history like thunder over the Carpathians. The first and only Dacian king to unify the tribes under one banner, one sword. But what if his legacy wasn't just political or military? What if it was genetic? Here's where science meets legend. A Y-DNA haplogroup known as I2, Y3120 has become the focus of a growing hypothesis. Not a myth, not folklore. A measurable, testable thread in the human genome, with its center of diversity aligning eerily close to where Burbista once ruled. Coincidence? Or are we staring at a bloodline that never died? This lineage, I2, Y3120, is found today in regions historically associated with Dacian strongholds. From the Oresti Mountains to the plains of Muntenia, its footprint matches the ancient frontiers of Burbista's empire. And even more intriguing, its highest modern frequencies are concentrated in the Central and Western Balkans, suggesting it didn't spread randomly. It radiated from a core. That core might have been royal. Now, here's what fascinated me personally. In 2023, a genomic study out of South Moravia dated a male sample to around 1,200 years ago, carrying this very subclade. The sample was isolated, out of place, yet unmistakably Balkan in origin. It raised a simple, profound question. How did a Balkan signature end up hundreds of kilometers away, unless someone carried it there? And that's where history fills in the gaps. After the Roman conquest of Dacia, thousands of Dacians were relocated as soldiers, miners, and craftsmen across the empire. From Dalmatia to Egypt, they were scattered. But their genes? They stayed intact, which means somewhere out there, a descendant of Burbista could be walking among us. Maybe in Timișoara, maybe in Berlin, maybe watching this video right now. And here's the twist. No ancient DNA from Burbista has ever been found. We don't have his remains, just ruins, legends, and this persistent genetic riddle. So let me ask you this. If you had the chance to trace your paternal lineage and found it pointed back to Dacia's Iron Age core, would it change how you see yourself? Would it matter to you to know your blood once stood against Rome? Drop a comment if you've tested your Y-DNA, or if you've ever wondered whether royalty flows through your veins. Because sometimes, history doesn't live in books. It lives in us. 106 AD. Rome crosses the Danube, and everything changes. The Dacians, once sovereign in their mountain strongholds, were overrun by the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The war was brutal, the aftermath even more so. Temples were torn down, gold stripped, fortresses razed. But beneath the ashes of conquest, something ancient refused to die. The Romans thought they had absorbed Dacia, and in many ways they did. They left roads, cities, and a Latin tongue that echoes through modern Romanian. But if you look beneath the language, beyond the ruins, and into the chromosomes, a different story emerges. The Balkan genetic core, it stayed. Even after Roman soldiers settled, even after administrators married local women, even after Latin names replaced Dacian ones on milestone stones. The bloodlines held their ground. You want proof? Let's talk hard data. Modern Y-DNA studies in Romania show something fascinating. The most common haplogroup is in italic R1b. It's I2A1b, deeply Balkan in origin. Not Roman, not imported, indigenous, persistent, and unshaken. That tells us something powerful. Rome may have changed the surface, but the genetic foundation was already set. During my own research, I stumbled across data from Roman-era necropolises in southeastern Europe. What stunned me wasn't the diversity of ancestry. It was how strong the local signals remained. Even at sites believed to be dominated by Roman settlers, nearly half of the individuals had Balkan Iron Age genetic components. Now stop and think about that. How do you conquer a land, but not its people? The answer is simple. You don't. Not completely. You overlay. You blend. You leave your mark, but the old DNA, it waits. And this isn't just about men. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, shows the same pattern. Deep Balkan maternal lineages endured across generations, even while Roman influence reshaped culture, administration, and identity. So here's a provocative question. Are modern Romanians descendants of Romans? Or of the Dacians Rome failed to erase? What if the real story of Romanian origins isn't about conquest at all, but about resistance through inheritance? Let us know your take in the comments. Have you done a DNA test that showed unexpected Balkan ancestry? Do you identify more with the Roman legacy, or something older? Let's be honest, every country has its origin myth, a tale of heroic ancestors, untouched bloodlines, and ancient greatness passed down like an unbroken chain. For Romanians, that myth often starts with the Dacians, a proud, mountain-born people, noble, pure, unconquered in spirit. It's a story told in classrooms, carved into statues, echoed in folklore. But here's the twist. Genetics doesn't deal in legends. It deals in layers. And the deeper you dig, the blurrier the line between myth and measurable truth becomes. Modern DNA studies have made one thing very clear. There's no such thing as a pure lineage. Not in the Balkans. Not anywhere. The region has been a human superhighway for 10,000 years, and Dacia sat right in the middle of it. I remember seeing a forum post where someone proudly declared, "I'm 100% Dacian. My haplogroup proves it." The irony. The marker they shared, EV13, also appears in Greeks, Albanians, Bulgarians, and even parts of Italy. It's not a badge of exclusivity. It's a sign of shared roots. And that's exactly the point. True uniqueness doesn't come from isolation. It comes from fusion. The Dacians were never a sealed-off tribe untouched by outsiders. They were part of a bigger story, a swirling mix of Neolithic farmers, Indo-European migrants, Thracian neighbors, and yes, Roman influence. But here's where it gets complicated. Popular narratives online, and sometimes in politics, try to weaponize genetics. You'll hear claims like Romanians are 60% Slavic, or Dacians were racially distinct from everyone else. These statements get clicks, but they ignore the reality. Human DNA doesn't obey borders. In fact, many geneticists warn against drawing lines that science can't support. Because when we try to force DNA to confirm our favorite version of history, we stop listening to what the evidence is really saying. And the evidence says this. Romanians today carry markers from the Dacians, from the Romans, from the Slavs, and from every people who ever passed through those mountains. That doesn't dilute the Dacian legacy, it amplifies it. Because somehow, across millennia of change, their core survived. Ask yourself this. What's more powerful? A bloodline that stayed untouched, or one that adapted, absorbed, and still managed to echo through time? Let me hear your thoughts. Is identity about DNA, culture, language, or all three? Have you ever questioned the history you were taught after reading your own ancestry report? Zoom out. Picture Europe not as it looks today, with nations and borders, but as it was 3,000 years ago. Rivers instead of frontiers, forests instead of flags. And in the middle of it all, like a living heartbeat, the Carpathian Basin. This wasn't just a place on a map. It was the meeting point of migrations, the gateway between East and West, the hinge of empires. And long before the Dacians built their hilltop fortresses, others were already moving through the same valleys, leaving behind fragments of who they were, buried in the soil and now in our cells. Understanding Dacian DNA means seeing the full picture, not just of one tribe, but of the entire Paleobalkan web. Cultures like the Starcevo and Cucutini weren't just archaeological names, they were genetic ancestors. They brought with them early European farming lineages, and they stayed. They didn't disappear when the Dacians rose, they became part of them. And here's where the story gets fascinating. Modern genome sequencing from this region shows a repeated pattern, deep continuity beneath surface-level change. Even as Scythians, Sarmatians, and Huns swept through the plains, the core genetic structure remained rooted, as if the land itself was resistant to replacement. One study I came across, examining samples from the migration period, found that even after the arrival of steppe groups with East Eurasian ancestry, the majority of DNA still reflected older European components. The newcomers didn't erase the locals. They simply layered onto them. So when we talk about the Dacians, we're not looking at an isolated anomaly. We're seeing a concentrated node in a massive network, a convergence of farming lineages from Anatolia, steppe warriors from the Pontic-Caspian region, and indigenous Balkan hunter-gatherers. That blend is what made their genomes so rich, so complex, and so hard to pin down. But here's the kicker. Genetic data from modern populations shows that these ancient threads didn't unravel. They twisted tighter. The same haplogroups found in ancient graves are still present today. Not in the same form, but evolved, recombined, and passed down through centuries of movement, war, and survival. Ask yourself this. If the Dacians were just one chapter in a much older book, what does that say about the genetic story we think we know? Have you ever looked at a map of ancient cultures and seen your home fall at the crossroads? Let us know below, because this isn't just history. It's personal. What if the past isn't buried in the ground, but walking down the street? You pass them every day. Strangers in cities, farmers in the hills, students on their phones. And some of them, without knowing it, are carrying the last traces of a vanished people, the Dacians. No statues, no epic poems, just fragments, hidden in chromosomes, waiting to be noticed. When scientists studied the genetic makeup of modern Romanians, Moldovans, and Balkan groups, they weren't hunting for a myth. They expected to find a patchwork of migrations, Slavic, Roman, Turkic. But what they found, tucked beneath it all, was something older, something local, a substratum that refused to vanish. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dominant, but it was there, quietly holding the foundation together. Populations like the Sango in eastern Romania, or the Aromanians scattered across Macedonia and Greece, show elevated frequencies of certain lineages like I2 and EV13. These aren't random blips. These are echoes. And the closer you get to the Carpathians, the louder they become. During a side project last year, I ran a dataset comparing modern Balkan Y-DNA with ancient Bronze Age and Iron Age samples. What amazed me wasn't the similarity. It was the stability. Despite invasions, despite collapse, despite entire languages disappearing, the core didn't move. But genetics isn't always poetic. There's no clean line you can draw from a Dacian warrior to a modern office worker. What exists instead is inheritance, messy, layered, beautiful. You won't find a Dacian gene on 23andMe, but you might carry the haplogroup that once coursed through a blacksmith in Sarmazegetusa, or the maternal lineage of a healer who stood beneath Roman siege. And that raises a deeper question. Do we need a straight line to feel connected to the past? Or is the knowledge that we carry fragments, even scattered ones, enough? Have you ever looked at your DNA report and felt a strange sense of belonging to a time you've never lived? Drop your haplogroup or ancestry breakdown in the comments, and let's map this legacy together. Not all memories are carried in words. Some live in silence, in the spaces between chromosomes, in the fragile strands that connect us to people we'll never meet, from times we can't imagine. The Dacians are gone. Their temples are ruins. Their language is extinct. Their names forgotten by history. And yet they speak, not with voices, with sequences, with alleles passed down through the bodies of shepherds, scholars, soldiers, and you. Think about that for a moment. How many generations does it take for a story to vanish or survive? Modern genetics doesn't just track populations. It listens. It decodes the whispers buried in our blood. And sometimes, it finds stories we never knew we were part of. Like this one. The Dacians didn't leave behind a national epic. What they left is far more intimate. A genetic presence that defies erasure. When I first read about their practice of cremation, it felt like a dead end. How do you reconstruct a population when they leave no remains? But the more I studied, the more I realized they didn't disappear. They diffused. They blended into the bloodstream of Eastern Europe, dissolving into the Balkans like ink in water. And the traces are everywhere. In isolated villages where rare haplogroups persist. In modern Romanians with maternal lines tied to Neolithic Europe. In fragmented markers shared by populations who no longer speak the same language, but still carry the same ancestral code. That's the beauty and the tragedy of genetic memory. It keeps the facts, but loses the faces. So the question becomes, how do we honor people whose monuments have turned to dust, but whose legacy still pulses through veins? Maybe it's this. Maybe it's telling their story again, with science instead of stone, with genomes instead of scrolls. Because the more we understand about the Dacians, through DNA, through archaeology, through the living echoes in modern populations, the more we see how history doesn't just happen. It lingers. And now, you're part of that story too. If you've ever felt a pull toward a place without knowing why, a strange familiarity with a landscape, a symbol, a surname, maybe you're not imagining it. Maybe it's memory, old memory, passed down in silence, waiting to be heard.